Well, hello everybody, and we're continuing with our Roman lectures, and today we'll discuss the emperors of the 1st century AD, the followers essentially for 3/4 of a century. They'll be of the house of Augustus and Caesar, and then there'll be 3 at the end from a different dynasty. The first, as we know, the first to follow in Caesar's steps was his great nephew, and his name originally was Octavian. Then he was given an honorific by the Senate of Augustus, and that's how he is known throughout history, pretty much. He was still in his teens, late teens, when he inherited this responsibility, and the beginning of his reign was essentially a civil war. First, there was a civil war against the assassins of Julius Caesar, but then he and Mark Antony parted ways, both literally and otherwise. Mark Antony went to Egypt and stayed there with Cleopatra, became her second husband, and Octavian came to Rome and began a smear campaign against Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Well, obviously, Mark Antony and Cleopatra did the same in Egypt, but then the Egyptians didn't really care, whereas the Romans did care very much. Cleopatra and Mark Antony lost the last battle of Actium, and that happened in the year 31 BC, and Octavian was supreme. Consequently, both Cleopatra and Mark Antony will commit suicide, and Octavian will gather the reins of power into his own hands. And interestingly enough, will prove a very capable leader who will establish peace in the empire. And as it says here, while fighting for dominance, he paid very little attention to legality, morality, ethics. But once he established himself as a ruler, he in fact tried very hard to rule justly, to respect the Senate. He even announced once that the Republic is restored. Needless to say, of course, it was only an image of the Republic, but then he did learn from his adopted father, from his mistakes, and never put himself on the forefront, and was in fact very eager to restore the original Roman values. The values of honesty, thrift, simplicity, endurance, and at the same time respect for the old gods of Rome, because as you may have observed, by this time Rome has become wealthy, and with this came fascination with various mysteries. Now Augustus, while he certainly did not discourage those, he nevertheless very much emphasized the original values and was successful at that. He inaugurated restoration of old temples, and in addition to a whole huge building program. So much for Augustus. His successor was his own adopted son. He was the son of his wife Livia, who had been married before, and she in fact was married to someone of the Republican faction, and so her husband and she and her son, when he was a young child, had to flee from the vengeance of Augustus and Mark Antony, from the proscriptions that were announced after Julius Caesar's assassinations. During those proscriptions, a great orator by the name of Cicero lost his life. However, with time, when things calmed down, Livia, who herself was a very remarkable woman, she divorced the husband and in fact married Octavian. Tiberius was certainly not his first choice. There were 4 others before Tiberius. They were including children of his daughter Julia, but all of them died under odd circumstances at a very young age. And Robert Graves, who is the author of Claudius, lays the fault for their deaths at Livia's feet. We don't know. There are absolutely no certain facts that she was guilty. Nevertheless, it was her son ultimately who was adopted by Augustus and became emperor. Now, much is said about Tiberius. Soon enough, he left Rome. He didn't like Rome. He hated gladiatorial games, absolutely despised them. Left Rome, built himself a spectacular house on the island of Capri, right here, and according to rumors, gathered around himself beautiful boys, beautiful girls, a whole slew of essentially sexual slaves, and proceeded with his unattractive habits. But then, according to others, all he took with him were really Greek philosophers, and just engaged in intellectual conversation. But basically, he continued the policy of his adopted father, the policy of moderation. Interestingly, while Augustus was emperor almost 50 years, now Tiberius half of that period. The one definite factual shadow on his reputation is that as he escaped to Capri, he left one Sejanus in command of Rome, and this Sejanus, played by Patrick Stewart in Claudius, had ideas about his station, and in fact instituted a reign of terror in Rome, which was horrific, and prescriptions. Again, no one was safe anymore. It seems that he wished to be emperor after Tiberius, but ultimately that didn't work out. Tiberius was informed, and Sejanus was arrested and executed. But that was a very dark period during Tiberius's reign. He continued the habit of Augustus and Livia in portraying himself very youthful. As you see here, he did not become emperor until he was about 46. He was a very successful military general. So despite the fact that he had become emperor at a rather advanced age, well, certainly according to Roman calculation, he always portrayed himself young, youthful, and in fact somewhat similar to Augustus. I mean, there are differences, particularly in the way the hair goes, and the difference particularly that he, in fact, tried to portray himself similar to Augustus, but also definitely as a son of Livia. Perhaps you remember this portrait of Livia, and it's difficult to tell, of course, from marble statues, but a number of studies were made, and clearly Tiberius's busts were modeled on both Livia and Augustus. He was very anxious because he wasn't technically Augustus's. He wasn't Augustus's son. He came from a completely different house. But then all the more he wished to associate himself with Augustus and with Caesar, and as part of the so-called Julio-Claudian line. So thus we are very fortunate to have this image of a sacrifice, the so-called sua vitarilia. Perhaps you see this better here, which is sua vitarilia is a sacrifice of three animals. There's a hog, there's a sheep, lamb, and a bullock. It probably goes back to the Etruscans, this triple sacrifice, because if you remember, the temple of Jupiter had three cellars. It was not only Jupiter, but also his wife Juno and his daughter Minerva. And it's possible, and the idea came from the Etruscans, from their own local gods that were similar to the Greek gods, and therefore they were later adopted. So it's possible that each of these animals was meant for one of the gods, and thus there are three animals being sacrificed. It's supposed to be, presumably it is only half of a frieze. This comes from a frieze, and you can see the two identical trees, and the other altar is identical to this altar. So it's very possible that the other half of this image was essentially a mirror image, and while this is Tiberius himself, As emperor, he is also Pontifex Maximus. The other side had Augustus in identical position with identical retinue here, and here's a man with an axe who is about to sacrifice these animals, which is again the Tiberius's attempt to equate himself to his adopted father. Here it is in marble, so it's a double servituria, and it belongs, not sure, but the first half of the first century AD, and the sacrifice, as I said, pig, ram, and bull, led by a priest, and so, as I said, this is probably Tiberius, and on the other side was a very similar, or in fact identical, mirror image of Augustus. As you can see, of course, the idea of a procession is very much taken from the apparatus and then adopted to various uses. Here is still another image, if you can see it better here. This is our fellow with the axe. You can see it better here. Yeah, it's in graphic version. It looks better. And here, of course, as you remember, the Imperial Procession, where people are represented in profile as they move forward. It is very much the same thing here. So the idea is taken from the apparatus. Another piece of art that comes from Tiberian reign that shows Tiberius. It's the town of Boscoriali is another town around Vesuvius, near Pompeii. So another town that was affected, that was covered by ashes and the debris from Vesuvius. And there was found an absolutely exquisite collection of silver, truly beautiful. And as it says, hundreds of pieces of silverware, also gold coins and jewelry. We know to whom the house belonged, so clearly a very wealthy man. And because it was the French who excavated the site, so most of it is in the Louvre. One of the so-called scyphus cups of Tiberius, and it shows Tiberius as he writes. Now he is at this point is a general. He is not emperor yet, and he is given a triumph. Now and he is a triumphator, and as you remember, this is the one time in a general's life, in any man's life who was a successful general, where one in fact felt like God. And the procession began in the Field of Mars, outside the walls, the fortifications of Rome, and then went on near the theater of Pompeii, near the theater of Marcellius, and then around the Hippodrome on the other side of the Palatine, and then around through the Forum, the Roman Forum, and up the steps of the Temple of Jupiter. Now, if you remember the Etruscan lecture, the Temple of Jupiter was actually built by the Etruscans. One hopes that there was Volkov Bay, because Day was very famous for its crafts and also very famous for its terracotta. And then inside, Jupiter himself and the other two figures of Minerva and Juno, it was all done in terracotta. And not only that, but the face of Jupiter was also additionally painted a reddish color. So as a result, these triumphators, these generals, would paint their faces and even the bodies in a red color to imitate the god. I mean, this is when they were godly. This is when they were worshipped by the entire population of Rome. And those triumphal processions were really extraordinary. I mean, the entire Senate came first, then the lute, then the slaves, then the general himself. However, and this tradition was behind the general stood a slave, as you see here, who, on the one hand, kept the crown of laurel around, above his head, but also he kept whispering to him, "You're not God, you're not divine, you're still mortal," just to remind the general not to have this whole thing go to his head. Here he is in his triumphal chariot, and he's holding a branch of laurel and a scepter with an eagle on it. He is preceded by lictors and followed, and then the other side of the cup And the Scyphos cup means it had two handles. Here you can see it better. There's the emperor himself, and there's the man who's holding his wreath above his head, and as he proceeds in his chariot through Roman architecture. And you can see a bit of this here as well. The other side is the ultimate part of the triumph, because before a general would depart on his campaign, he would also sacrifice at the temple of Jupiter, giving all sorts of promises that he will capture the enemy, he will be victorious, he will return as a triumphator. So the beginning shows the triumph, he's returning. And the one side of the cup. And the second side of the cup shows him back at the temple of Jupiter, and there's the temple right there, where he sacrifices again, where he delivers his promise, and in fact frees himself from the promise, because the promise had in fact been fulfilled. And that's what you see. There's a bullock that's being sacrificed by this fellow with an axe, because the Romans were so attentive and particularly since the age of Augustus, to tradition, just as the Sua Vittorilia we saw harkens back very much to the Imperial Procession on the Arapaches. So this, you see with the temple, this harkens back again to Arapaches and to the image of Aeneas. Aeneas, who is also sacrificing at the temple. And there's the temple. Aeneas, who came from Troy, his father died on the way, but the father brought the the Lares and Penates, the household gods. And here we see inside the temple the two figures, presumably Lares and Penates. So anybody who saw this would immediately think of that. So there's this continuous line of tradition. And then on the second cup, Augustus is now represented. It's a double cup, just as the double sacrifice. There's Tiberius and there's Augustus. And Augustus is here. He's holding an orb in his right hand, and he is surrounded by, there's Venus here with Cupid, because remember, they are relatives, they're cousins. I mean, Venus was the mother of Cupid, and as such, she is the ancestress of Augustus, and Cupid is the cousin. And on the other hand, there is Venus's lover, Mars, who is presenting the conquered provinces to Augustus. So this is what this is about here. And as you see, this is a double-handled cup. Now, Venus and Mars, remember, Venus and Mars. Venus is the mother of Cupid, mother of Aeneas. Check. Mars is the father of Romulus and Remus. So both of these deities will be very, very important. Plus, Augustus will also adopt Apollo as his patron deity. Let's go to this. This is a cameo. It's an incredible skill, in fact, to carve a cameo. Usually a sardonyx or an onyx would be chosen because they have so many layers of different colors, those stones. And so a cameo cutter would have to have this remarkable skill at cutting sometimes just a millimeter or 2 millimeter thin surface in order to cut to the next level where a different color was represented, and thus create a multicolored image. The cameo cutters, just as goldsmiths and silversmiths, were held in tremendous respect by the Romans. We even have a name, Dioscorides, who may have cut this, or one of his disciples, because it's known that Dioscorides worked at the court of Tiberius. So what you see here is a two-registered cameo, and it's quite large. It's about this size. And in the upper register, we see Augustus. Augustus in apotheosis, that is when Augustus, after death, he became God. And he's sitting here. Let me see, do I have a larger? Here, you may see it better. He is sitting on the throne next to the goddess Roma. with whom he is now associated, because the Numen is the divine presence, and many ancient societies saw Numen in everything. In Etruscans, for instance, they saw divine presence in streams, in grass, in trees, in flowers, certainly in birds, and in the sky. So Numen, N-U-M-E-N, was the very essence of divinity that spread everywhere. And now Augustus, of course, not as a person, but as an emperor, and now deceased and proclaimed divine, certainly has his Numen. And that Numen also is combined with the goddess Roma, who is an allegory of Rome itself, allegory of the empire, that also acquired Numen of her own. And so the two of them are sitting here, and above is shown a medallion with Capricorn, because that was the month of Augustus's birthday. Then on the to the left of Augustus, to our right, we see the allegory of the city of Rome herself, because as you see, she's wearing a crown of fortifications, and usually when you see a female figure with a crown of that looks like fortifications, it's usually an allegory of one city or another city. So this is the allegory of the city of Rome itself, and she's crowning Augustus with the wreath of laurel. And this may be the male figure, may be the personification of the Mediterranean. That was the world. The world was the Mediterranean and lands around it, but it was felt that Rome pretty much held sway. And still another personification, maybe a personification of virtu, or virtue, which is something that Augustus very much upheld. Virtue / piety. Same idea. Respect for the gods, respect for the country, respect for one's elders, all of that combined in this virtue. Also, of course, honesty, honor, it was all combined there. And the Romans, just as Etruscans before them began to do that, allegorized all these qualities. Since Numen, as they understood, was very much alive, as humans are alive, they began to allegorize them with human figures. Then on the other side, we're not quite sure who this boy is, but then here, what we see is Tiberius himself. Again, Tiberius places himself together with Augustus. He is stepping from the chariot, and the chariot is led by victory, by personification of victory. And the chariot, it's brilliantly done, because as you see, while the figures in front of us are portrayed either in profile or three-quarter view, the chariot in fact is done in foreshortening, in other words, at an angle to our plane of vision, which is a very sophisticated method of representation. So you see the backs of the horses, and then the foreshortened chariot, because everything obviously looks foreshortened, sort of shorter to our view, and then Tiberius stepping off the chariot. Augustus also is equated with with Jupiter, because right here at his feet we see an eagle, and eagle is the bird of Jupiter. So that's the top layer, and then the second layer, the bottom layer, is a defeat of some barbarians. While Capricorn is the birth sign of Augustus, here on the shield we see Scorpion, and the Scorpion is the month sign of Tiberius. Here those two barbarians again, or some others, who are sitting. This time they are tied up and cannot move, while the Romans are lifting a tree trunk, which holds the banners, the standards of the enemy. So here is the sign of greatness, of divinity, of conquest, of invincibility, and here is a proof of how this had been achieved. This is Augustus. As you see, this is the Capricorn, and this is one of the coins and with the Capricorn on it. And here is still another spectacular cameo. This one is very large. This one is 31 centimeters. So yeah, it's the large. It's even larger than the first one. The largest imperial cameo that survived, and this one has 3 registers, as you see. The general meaning of the cameo again is essentially continuation. First Augustus, then Tiberius, then others. So the continuation of the line of the Julio-Claudians. Here's a bit of an explanation. Here's the iconography now. The iconography essentially is the content, what's on the piece of art. One can look at a piece of art from the point of view of style, which then pretty much ignores the content and just looks at it, comparing it to other styles, to styles that preceded it, styles that are going to succeed it, or similar styles. So that's one way of looking at it. And then another way of looking at it is from the point of view of iconography, which places the piece of art in the context of, in its historical context, and gives, and in which case the work of art becomes a historical document. And of course, in cases like the Etruscans or earlier pre-literate societies, it actually becomes a very important piece of history and piece of archaeology. So, iconography. The largest, it is engraved of 24 layers. There are 24 layers, yes, one on top of it. It is sardonyx, divided up into 3 levels. The general meaning and propagandistic intent of the work is to assert the dynastic continuity of the Julio-Claudians. So the upper level are the dead members. So there is Augustus, and who is surrounded by Drusus II and Germanicus. Germanicus is flying on Pegasus, and Augustus here is flying on the back of a personification of eternity, for the lack of better explanation.
Of course he is.
So this is what this is. And then Pegasus is a winged horse. So Augustus. Then of course underneath Augustus there'll be Tiberius. In the middle level are the living ones. So the Emperor Tiberius, right here in the center, accompanied by his mother Livia, and with Nero Drusus, who was Tiberius's designated heir, right here. Sitting, there's the Nero Drusus, this is his mother Livia, standing by him on one side, and still another Drusus, and Caligula, right here, on the other side. And then here again are conquered barbarians. So the idea is very similar to the previous cameo. They're spectacular. There are 2 types. Either it's a cameo where the background is cut away, or there's an intaglio. An intaglio is a reversed cameo where one cuts into the stone. The signet rings are intaglio, so that the ring is used in order to stamp an impression, and they are intaglio. But these are cameos. After Tiberius came Caligula, and he really is the first of the so-called madmen. There'll be Caligula, then Nero will fall into the same category, Domitian, and as a result they will all be in fact assassinated. Augustus ruled almost half a century, then Tiberius half that time, and then came Caligula, who was a nephew. He became the next emperor, quite young as well, and he is played brilliantly by John Hurt. I mean, he was mad. And I mean, I suppose he was one of those examples, because they all married one another, of course, brothers and sisters and cousins and what have you. So he was obviously one of the results of marriage between very close relatives, and well, he was mad. Fortunately, he was only there for 4 years, but again, the Reign of Terror was instituted. He very much considered himself a god in his own right while he was alive in Rome. He required the senators and high officials to prostrate themselves before him, and was in love with his horse, whom he dressed in purple and invited to dinner, and even wrote invitations to dinner from the horse's name. He was rumored to have slept with both his sisters, and in fact to to kill one of them. Well, who knows? I mean, anything is possible with a madman like himself. So he was ultimately assassinated by Imperial Guard. Here he is. By AD 38, there was no doubt that the emperor of the civilized world was in fact a dangerous madman. So he was done away with. The portraits again show a lovely youth, an intelligent, sensitive face, and the face that belongs again to the Julio-Claudians. So it very much belongs in the same tradition. In fact, Caligula presumably was balding, even in his very young years. But of course, the portrait busts do not show it. There's one portrait statue that exists of Caligula right here, and it's in Richmond. So if anyone would like to go there, and so as it says, it shows him not so much officiating, but rather informal. He is wearing a Roman toga, but his stance, his casual turn of the head, all make it rather sort of a naturalistic representation. And we should not forget that all of this was painted, so it made it all the more natural looking and immediately present. His mother was Agrippina the Elder, right here. And she was the wife of one Germanicus and second granddaughter of Augustus. She was also sister-in-law, stepdaughter, daughter-in-law of Tiberius, mother of Caligula. She was related to everybody, as I said. The reason, very possibly, that Caligula was in fact a madman was consanguinity. That blood just was all the same blood that's being mixed. What's interesting about this bust, which is posthumous, it was done in close to the middle of the 1st century AD, and even though she was a close relative of Tiberius, the two of them did not get along very much. Did not get along, and ultimately I think she was sent to some remote island, and so the bust is interesting because when you compare that bust with the bust of Livia, you can just see how fashion changes, and fashion changed with them as much as it changes with us. I mean, when we think of the hair being worn back in the 70s and today and in between, I mean, it's all very, very different. And here you see that at the time of Augustus, at the time of Livia, it was rather severe with this little nodus on top, and all gathered in a bun, whereas 40 years later, the hair was very free, was allowed to frame the face in these rich curls fall on the shoulder, and the execution of the bust is very good, is very competent, because the drills and the chisels that cut very deeply into the hair, creating this play of light and dark, is pretty virtuoso. And then, after the assassination of Caligula, the Senate in fact considered the return to the Republic. No kings anymore, no emperors. But it just so happened that Caligula's uncle and Germanicus's brother, by the name of Claudius, he was hiding behind a curtain in one of the rooms of the imperial palace, hiding essentially from assassinations, because one assassinates emperor, then his family, then friends, etc. So Claudius was hiding behind the curtain, and that's where the imperial guards found him, and in fact proclaimed him emperor on the spot. And so this was the first time, in fact, when a Roman emperor was proclaimed by the army, and not appointed by a senate, or at least agreed to by a senate. And Claudius was already 51 when he became emperor, and I mean even older than his uncle Tiberius when he became emperor, and he ruled for 13 years, close to 14 even. So it's getting smaller and smaller the time of rule. He is played brilliantly in I, Claudius. The interesting part about it is that he was indeed short, possessed neither natural dignity nor authority, had a staggering walk, embarrassing habits, laughed like a donkey, and his nose ran, and he was just an embarrassment all around. He was also extremely sickly. All of that stopped suddenly when he became emperor. He became perfectly healthy, and the embarrassing habits, except he stuttered a bit. But even that became better. He was, in fact, a very capable emperor. He became a very capable emperor. In fact, he upheld Augustan moderation, was a scholar of considerable repute. He wrote the history of the Etruscans. I think, presumably he in fact wrote the history of the Julio-Claudians, and but none of that survived. So we don't have it. We only know that he did write that. His first wife was Etruscan. I think altogether he had 4 or 5 wives, and I mean his choice of wives was pretty much a disaster, as we shall see. And he preferred the advice of the educated and trained non-Roman executives, and in fact freedmen, rather than having his aristocratic peers help him in his rule, which history shows often is the case, because of course either servants or freedmen, as in this case, their life, their success depends very much on the men they serve. Not born into similar circles. They were not born into aristocracy, so they did not give themselves airs. They were, they knew essentially where their bread was buttered, and they were very loyal to that source, which was the case with Claudius. Whereas, of course, in a case of surrounding oneself with one's peers, essentially, one always is in danger of them thinking themselves better than yourself and trying to take your place.
So there's even a line in the TV series which I love, which is when he's made emperor, one of the senators accuses him, saying, you know, but you are accused of being half-witted. And Claudius looks at him and goes, this is true, I have been accused of being half-witted, and I do stutter and I do stammer, and yet I am alive, which is more than can be said for most of my family. So clearly it is the quality, not the quantity, of wits that was required here.
Right.
And it really, that line just really spells out for you how there's this theme that he needs to keep playing the fool, because so long as he plays the fool,
he survives.
He's not a risk to anyone. He's literally not worth killing.
And it's true, but even historically, as you saw, all Augustus's heirs, they died, all Tiberius's heirs, they all died. He's the only one, literally, who survived.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very true. One of his wives was one Messalina, who became, her name in fact, became notorious with a woman of easy virtue. She is, this is a brilliant painting by Gustave Moreau. She presumably was anxious for as many lovers as possible, and challenged the most notorious Roman prostitute once to a contest, which she won. Once Claudius found out about it, she was executed, but nevertheless she was very notorious. Even his first actions in office pretty much mark him as an exceptional ruler, even though often you will hear that Claudius was a half-wit exactly, or a stutterer, but the fact is he was a very good ruler. He abolished the treason trials, the proscriptions. He burned the criminal records, destroyed Caligula's infamous stock of poisons. He returned the possessions that were confiscated by Caligula, reformed financial affairs. He created separate fund for the emperor private household, apart from the empire, and was a great builder. He in fact built up the port of Ostia to ease up the traffic on the Tiber, and I mean today it's all silted up. So when you go to Ostia Antica, it's not directly on the sea, because, as I said, well, it's all silted up. But it was very functional at the time, and took great care as judge, presiding over the imperial law court, instituted judicial reforms, and was very charitable, and instituted a number of offices, in fact, that helped the weak and the helpless. There is an idealized statue of Claudius, and we kind of know their features generally either from coins or from inscriptions. And Claudius in particular had a very wide forehead, and he's recognized as such. I mean, needless to say, it's idealized, and it is done in this Roman tradition of placing a portrait head on an idealistic body. But in this case, it's actually done quite sensitively, because I mean, if you really look at the face, you see it's not a youthful face, but it's not one of those horrifically ugly faces either. And because the torso is presented as that of a very muscular hero, that also suggests not the first flash of youth, but rather a more mature persona. So it works, in fact. This one does work. And he is wearing the wreath, and that comes from Cerveteri, from the famous Etruscan town. So as you see, you can see the face here. I mean, it's not a smooth face. He has bags under his eyes. The skin is not that of the first youth. Large ears, but nevertheless, it's still the altogether, I would say the figure works. Just as those triads with the gods, Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, the Julio-Claudians also did group portraits of their family. So these three, in fact, are from the Basilica of Velleia. Nero, who will succeed Claudius. Claudius, after Messalina, he will marry his niece, his direct niece, the daughter of his brother, and whose name was Agrippina the Younger. And she had a son before they were married. And Agrippina, now Claudius had a son, Britannicus, by Messalina. Britannicus technically was next in line after Claudius, but then Agrippina was very clever, and she managed to marry her own son Nero to his own cousin, who was Claudius's daughter. And because the daughter was older than the son, at any rate, Nero became first to the throne before Britannicus. And once he became emperor, I mean, he killed everybody anyway. Nero was a direct descendant, in fact, of Caligula. Well, it's just really those two who were horrific in their family. I mean, the rest of them were right. But it was Caligula and Nero. This is a triple presentation of the three members of the family. So here would be Claudius, then Agrippina, and the young Nero, who still has the round medal on his, it was called a bulla, on his chest, and Roman children until their initiation into manhood all wore it. What we see is frontal representation, which is quite rare, because until then, starting with the outer patches, the representation usually is in profile, half profile, three quarters, this sort of thing. So here we have again Augustus as Mars. Augustus as Mars is on the far right. He's also wearing what's called the civic crown, and then to the left of Augustus is Livia, and Livia now is represented as Venus. And again, Mars and Venus. Mars and Venus. They were lovers in Greek mythology, and they both became sires of the Julio-Claudians. Eros, or Cupid, is on her left shoulder. Now, and her dress, in fact, is based on Venus genetrix, on Aphrodite in the Chimation in the 5th century BC. And then to the left of Livia is presumably Germanicus. Germanicus, who in fact himself was a great general, and he is the father of Caligula, amazingly as it is. He is the husband of Agrippina, and the elder, and the father of Caligula. And then and the figure to the left of Germanicus appears to be Drusus the elder, who was the father of Claudius. So this whole family is there. And the seated figure on the far left, that we don't see it very well, is identified as either Antonia, who was the wife of Drusus and the mother of Claudius, or a personification virtue or piety or any of those. So this is a dynastic group from Ravenna, and again, it's a frieze. And it's important to understand that while to us, of course, we have absolutely no idea who is who, but to people at the time, they could identify the attributions pretty quickly and know who is who. So as I said, really the main interest of this particular frieze is that this is the first time when an imperial family is shown practically in frontal view. Even now a number of faces are still in profile or three-quarter view. And again, from the same time comes this another brilliant cameo. And on this cameo, what we see is Claudius and his new wife, who also is his niece, Agrippina the younger. And we're not quite sure who they are, but possibly this is his brother, Germanicus, and Agrippina the elder. So brother, and these are two brothers, and this is a mother and a daughter. It's carved from, this is from 5 layers of sardonyx, beautiful transparency, and at times the layer is just 2 millimeters thin, which is really, it's 1/10 of a quarter inch, really extremely thin. So you can imagine that no mistakes were encouraged in this case, because the stones themselves were extremely valuable, and any mistake would necessitate throwing out the stone and starting again. So you can see how the workers, how the master craftsmen who did this were held in high regard. Here you can see. And what you see is 2 cornucopias. Cornucopia is the horn of plenty. Here are the 2 horns of plenty with an eagle. An eagle is, at this point, is looking at Claudius, because Claudius is emperor. Here is another altar, the altar of piety, right here. And it's just one of the slabs. Presumably that was an altar, perhaps similar to the Arapaches, but we don't have the whole thing, of course. And so this shows historical relief. Again, the Romans, you see, remember the Greeks, when they wanted to commemorate something, they would use their own mythology as allegorizing a victory or allegorizing whatever they wish to remember. Whereas the Romans, for the Romans, the relief sculpture was in fact what for us are, well, newspapers, except of course this lasted considerably longer. And the historical relief sculpture was very extensively used by the Romans. And very detailed execution, and this is again Suavitarilia or some other sacrifice before a temple, just as we saw Aeneas do it, just as we saw it with Augustus. So one outcome of creating such a body of sculpture is an attempt to create communal memories and historical memories, because these constantly were in front of those who came to see them, those who came to make sacrifice, and they looked at the reliefs, and again they were all painted, and remembered it. They remembered their trip there, they remembered their sacrifice, they would tell their grandchildren about it, then the grandchildren perhaps would come as well. So it all created the reminder of human participation in the workings of the empire. One column here is missing. This is supposed to be the temple of Mars, Mars Ultor in the Forum of Augustus, and the sacrifice here is before the temple in the Forum of Augustus. And by this time, Augustus, of course, was declared divus, the divine, and this was important as, again, propagation of the Julio-Claudian family. Here you can see it. Right there, there's a bullock being sacrificed, and there are other animals here. There are only 7 columns. Well, 1 column is missing, right there. And back we go again to the Arapaches. Same thing. There's in this case, there's a hog, but there's the temple and there's the sacrifice. Another interesting relief that shows Claudius. Claudius was the conqueror of Britain. I mean, Julius Caesar came to Britain, but he didn't didn't really conquer it. He came, he saw, and he left. In case with the Julius Caesar, it was Claudius who in fact brought the troops there and was the conqueror of Britain. So here, what you see, and it's the same, that very wide forehead, and Claudius vanquishing Britannia. And this comes from Sebastian in Turkey, from a temple of Augustus in Turkey. In other words, Claudius was still very anxious to draw that same continuous line between himself and Augustus. And here he's shown almost like the god Mithras. Actually, when we do talk about Mithras, when we're closer to Christianity, I should bring this thing up again to show. Also, among his great constructions was the Claudian Aqueduct. He provided Rome with more water still, with still more aqueducts. This Porta Maggiore, it's a double entry gateway, is at the point where two major roads came to Rome, and along those roads Claudius also built the aqueducts. And so this is the gate. We'll talk about this structure in the front when we talk about funerary monuments. What he did here is something very interesting. He, despite this anxiety to continue the Augustan line, where art was concerned, Claudius clearly had his own ideas. And building the aqueducts, and you perhaps you remember Pont du Gard, that's built of this undressed stone, a very rough stone, without polishing it or without facing it, with smoother stone, and that kind of conveyed the raw, unadulterated greatness of Rome, in addition to practical usages, because it was much easier to attach scaffolding to an undressed stone than to a polished one. Scaffolding when repairs were needed. So, clearly that must have impressed Claudius one way or another, because and he very much participated in all architectural undertakings. Because what you have here, so the top, yes, that was all smooth, and I have here the pronouncement of these are the aqueducts made by under Emperor Claudius, etc. So all of that was inscribed here. But what you see on the piers is something very interesting, because while the pediments and the entablatures and the Corinthian capitals are very carefully worked and done in a very traditional classical way, however, the piers themselves and the columns are done in that same very rough, undressed stone that the aqueducts had outside of Rome. And this is something very different. This is definitely a step away from the classicizing motifs, the classicizing columns with grooves, for instance, because all of this is done in very rough stone, including the arches, even the keystone and voussoirs. They are all undressed. Here you can perhaps see better here. This is the rough stone, and yet you see the pediment and the entablature. And the Corinthian columns, in fact, now are combined. There's a combination of a tiny little Ionic scroll with the acanthus leaf, and then everything else is done in rough stone, which it's something very different. Here, what it appeared to be presumably when it was first constructed, and these are in the attics. There, as you see, there are 3 attics, and they all have Roman inscriptions being dedicated to Claudius and his entrepreneurship. This is just a visual of those Claudian aqueducts, what it may have looked like. Just really just spectacular. It took, thousands and thousands and thousands of men to build them. Tremendous amount of labor, tremendous amount of skill. You remember the aqueducts worked on gravity, and calculations must have been tremendous. So when we talk of the Romans, comparing them to the Greeks as lacking imagination, they certainly did not lack it when it came to brilliant design.